The story goes that in the 1890s, 500 parrots were let loose across Scotland, each one trained to screech the same three words at drinkers in a pub: "Buy Pattison's Whisky." It was the boldest advertising stunt the country had ever seen, and it was paid for by the biggest lie in the history of Scotch. Two brothers, a dairy family from Edinburgh, built the loudest whisky empire in Britain in under a decade. Then, in a single week in December 1898, it collapsed so violently it dragged 9 other companies down with it, froze the entire Scotch industry for a generation, and sent both brothers to prison. Re-hook, and the strangest part: the parrots might be the only honest thing they ever did, because everything else was trained to repeat a number that was never real. To understand the crash, you have to understand the gold rush that caused it. In the 1880s, Robert and Walter Pattison weren't whisky men at all. Their family were dairy and provisions merchants in Edinburgh, milk, butter, ordinary trade. But something was happening across the water in France that would hand them a fortune. A tiny insect called phylloxera was devouring France's vineyards, and as the vines died, so did the country's brandy and cognac. For the first time in history, the world's drinkers needed something else to pour, and they turned to Scotch. Whisky stopped being a rough local drink and became a global luxury, almost overnight. Prices soared. Anyone who could get their hands on casks could get rich. Hook and the Pattison brothers, watching the milk trade while a gold rush roared next door, made a decision that would eventually put them both in a cell. They jumped. Robert started a whisky blending business, and within a few short years they'd turned it into a public company, floating it on the stock market right at the peak of the boom. And the money came in like a tide. Investors drunk on whisky profits threw cash at anything with the word Scotch attached. Pattison's went from provisions merchants to one of the most talked about names in the trade in the time it takes milliamperos businesses to rent an office. On paper, they were worth a fortune. Remember those two words. On paper. Because the paper was the entire trick. Here is what made Pattison's famous. And it wasn't the whisky, it was the noise. The brothers spent money on advertising on a scale nobody in the trade had ever dared. Enormous sums, more than rival firms made in profit, poured into making the Pattison's name impossible to escape. Billboards, newspaper spreads, spectacles. And, so the legend goes, 500 grey parrots, trained to shriek "Buy Pattison's Whisky," and handed out to publicans across the land, living breathing adverts squawking on the bar. Rehook. Now, here's the honest part, and it's stranger than the myth. Historians have never actually been able to prove the parrots were real. In a Victorian press obsessed with a good story, almost nobody wrote them down at the time. The parrots may be a tale that grew in the telling. But hold on to them anyway, because whether or not the birds existed, they are the perfect symbol of what Pattison's truly was. A machine for getting everyone to repeat the same thing, loudly, until it sounded like the truth. Behind the noise, the brothers lived like the fortune was already real. Grand houses, extravagance, the whole performance of enormous success. And the public bought it, literally. The louder Pattison's got, the more the shares were worth, and the more the shares were worth, the more the brothers could borrow. It was working, it was intoxicating. Hook. There was just one problem, sitting quietly in the accounts, that not a single shouting parrot was going to fix. The company was worth almost nothing. So how do you make a company that's worth almost nothing look like an empire? The Pattison brothers had 4 answers, and every one of them was a crime. 1. When they needed to borrow, they simply overvalued what they owned. Their property, their stock, inflated on paper far beyond anything it was actually worth, then waved in front of banks to unlock more credit. 2, and this is the clever one, they sold their own whisky stocks to themselves, buying and selling the same casks back and forth, each time at a higher price, manufacturing a paper value out of thin air. If you trade something with your own hand and call it a sale, you can make a barrel look priceless. 3. The dividends. Pattison's paid handsome returns to their shareholders. The proof: everyone assumed that the business was booming. Except the money wasn't coming from profit. They were paying investors out of the company's own capital, and out of the cash from new investors. That has a name today. It's a Ponzi scheme, decades before Charles Ponzi was born. The detail that gives the whole story away. They were caught buying cheap, ordinary whisky, mixing in a splash of the good stuff, and selling it as fine old Glenlivet. Think about what that means. They were watering down the whisky in the cask at the exact same time they were watering down the value in the accounts. The dilution wasn't a side scam, Rehook it was the business. Pattison's was a bottle of cheap spirit wearing an expensive label, and so was its share price. Every con like this depends on one thing: nobody looking too closely all at once. In December 1898, everybody looked at once. On the 5th of December, Pattison's preference stock, the safe shares, fell off a cliff, losing more than half its value in a day. 55%. Gone. The noise that had built the company now worked in reverse. Panic is louder than any advert. And a few days later came the blow that ends every story like this. The bank stopped believing. The Clydesdale Bank refused to extend another penny of credit. Ruck! And the moment the credit stopped, so did the magic. Because you cannot buy your own whiskey back from yourself with money you no longer have. Liquidators moved in and opened the books the parrots had been screaming over for years. And what they found was breathtaking. Around £500,000, an astronomical sum in 1898, simply could not be accounted for. And the company's real assets, once you stripped out the fake valuations and the casks they'd sold to themselves, came to less than half of that. The empire wasn't in trouble. The empire had never existed. It was a paper shell wrapped around a hole, and now everyone could see straight through it. 1 week, that's all it took at the end. But the damage didn't stop at the Pattisons' door. This is the part that turned a fraud into a catastrophe. Pattisons hadn't been operating alone. They owed money everywhere, to distillers, to suppliers, to firms who'd sold them whiskey on credit and were counting on being paid. When Pattisons fell, it pulled them down too. 9 companies collapsed in the wreckage, along with a string of smaller suppliers. By the end, the claims against the ruins came to over £700,000, and the shock rippled outward through the whole industry. The Scotch boom, the gold rush that had made the brothers, died with them. Confidence evaporated. Banks stopped lending to whiskey. Distilleries that had ramped up for endless demand were suddenly drowning in spirit nobody would fund. The industry sank into a depression that lasted, by some accounts, decades. Hook, one firm though, feasted on the corpse. The Distillers' Company, Pattison's giant rival, rode out the storm, then bought up the Pattison warehouses for barely a third of what they'd been valued at, and used the crash to tighten its grip on the entire trade for the next half-century. The brothers who tried to dominate Scotch ended up handing it to their enemy, and Robert and Walter, the law finally caught them. Both were tried and convicted of fraud and embezzlement. In 1901, Robert was sent to prison for 18 months, Walter for 9. The dairy boys who taught parrots to shout their name spent their loudest years in silence in a cell. The parrots, real or invented, they're the truest thing in this whole story. Because a parrot doesn't lie, and it doesn't know the truth either. It just repeats, with total confidence, whatever it's been trained to say. That was Pattisons. A company that got an entire country, the banks, the shareholders, the trade, the press, to repeat the same number loudly over and over until everybody believed a barrel of cheap spirit was worth a fortune. They didn't need 500 birds. They'd already turned half of Scotland into parrots. And the moment one person actually checked the price, the whole flock went quiet. A dairy family who caught a gold rush, built an empire on noise, and watered it down until there was nothing left but the label. 1 week in December, gone bust. Next on gone bust, a bank so respected that thousands of Scots trusted it with everything they owned, until the day it collapsed and they learned the law would take not just their savings, but their homes, their furniture, everything, to pay its debts. The bank whose own owners were marched to prison, and whose failure ruined a city. That story's on your screen now. Subscribe, so you don't miss how the giants fall.